Hello, everybody. After a long NFL offseason, we are finally back with our NFL Week 1 Survivor picks in a very similar format if you're a recurring viewer to what we've had before. We look at the top 9 favorites according to major sports books in the NFL. We analyze different qualitative and quantitative factors, such as quantitative being spread, money line, and converting that money line into its corresponding win percentage, and looking at some qualitative factors that I think are extremely prevalent when evaluating any survivor pick, and that is the two main ones being, is your team playing at home, which represents about a 3-point advantage in the NFL these days, and is this a divisional game? That divisional game aspect is very hard to quantify, but many of the times I see upsets, especially ones of bigger magnitude that heavily impact Survivor, most of the time it is either a divisional game or a team playing on the road. So I think those two factors, along with the spread, are very important to keep in mind. The picks, I'm trying out something new this year and created a Survivor League of my own for you and the rest of the professional picks viewers to compete against me and the likes of the Survivor hopefuls in a platform held by Splash Sports. $5 is the entry, but we have a link that I will post that when you join and use this link, you get $10 upon entry. So you can compete in this Survivor League against myself and many others essentially for free using this promo code. Hopefully, it can create some little bit more competitiveness amongst the channel and something that might be fun going forward. There isn't nearly as many heavy favorites as we're used to seeing in sort of the middle of the Survivor season, and I think the NFL is really trying to schedule a handful of really competitive games, and that's why you see a pretty steep drop off when you look at like the Broncos and the Eagles being the two teams favored by more than a touchdown, and a pretty quick decline here as I had to scrounge to the bottom of the barrel to fill out these 9 slots as you're getting guys like the Steelers on the road and even the Patriots at home that are favored by even less than a field goal here. I'm going to start the video out as we always do and talking about the teams that I'm a little bit leery of, and I think that you should proceed with caution and think twice before taking. The first of those teams is the Chiefs playing a road game, and the Chargers are too, as they're playing this game in Brazil to start out the season, and it is a divisional game where these two teams have no love lost over the last 2 seasons. The reason I'm picking this game is to proceed with caution is mainly because the Chargers have played the Chiefs so well throughout the last few seasons. Last year in their 2 matchups, the Chargers held the Chiefs to less than 20 points on both occasions. I think last year, if you watched the Chiefs play, you saw a big step down from what you're used to seeing offensively in terms of production from them, and it was the defense that really carried the way. The Chargers were a similar aspect where they had not quite, but very close to as formidable of a defense as the Chiefs had. And again, I think they match up really well with them as they had a top 3 coverage grade last year, and where the Chiefs really beat you is the passing game with Patrick Mahomes. Last 2 times these guys played, again, low scoring matchups, close games, although the Chiefs did take them both. If the Chargers are able to take a step up this year with now second-year head coach Jim Harbaugh and second-year offensive coordinator Greg Roman, those two have a lot of history in the past, getting this offense to click into gear with one more year of familiarity, drafting first-round running back Omarion Hampton behind an ever-improving offensive line in Los Angeles for the Chargers, there's a chance that they could sneak this one out when they're playing this game in Brazil, given the offensive production or lack thereof that the Chiefs have had last season. I do think the Chiefs should win this game. I think the Chargers have a little bit of lack of depth at the wide receiver position, which may really hinder them against the Chiefs defense that is smothering. But again, last 2 seasons these guys have played, they've been 1-score games, really low-scoring affairs, and I think that is proof enough to stay away from this divisional matchup here, especially in Week 1, where you're going to see both these 2 teams, frankly, playoff teams last year. These 2 teams will have better Survivor prospects later on this season. It's not often in Survivor, in really the Week 1 of the NFL season, where you get a 10-win playoff team, that being the Pittsburgh Steelers, going on the road against one of the worst teams in the league in the Jets last year with 5 wins and only getting 2.5-point favorites. I think that alone should be raising red flags for viewers thinking about taking the Steelers on the road against the Jets. I think there's a lot of question marks around both these two teams. And again, that even being reason enough to stay away. I think the biggest question mark of all for both these teams is quarterback, as Pittsburgh and the Jets basically swapped quarterbacks this offseason, with the Steelers signing Aaron Rodgers and the Jets getting Justin Fields to play quarterback for them. Both these defenses have a ton of great names, although the Jets didn't live up to the hype that their talent had on paper last year. Steelers defense is undeniably great, and was busy this offseason addressing their number 22 ranked coverage unit, getting some great cornerbacks in Darius Slay and Jalen Ramsey over there from the Dolphins. Steelers, I think they have a ton of talent on defense. Where they really lack is offensive depth. They did trade away George Pickens at wide receiver last year, or after the end of last year, getting DK Metcalf from Seattle. Other than that, the wide receiving room is maybe the thinnest in the NFL. And then a lot of questions at running back as well, as they've got more of a receiving scat back in Jaylen Warren, now assuming more of a full-time role, at least at the beginning of the season, as Najee Harris is now playing running back for the Chargers. And they also drafted rookie running back Caleb Johnson out of Iowa, out of the third round, I believe. And there's a lot of question marks to see what his role will be within this offense, especially early on. At quarterback, fewer bigger question marks in the NFL than Aaron Rodgers. Since leaving Green Bay, he really has looked like a shell of his former self and been basically incapable of playing at the high caliber that we're used to seeing, especially for all four quarters. Very, very lackluster season with the Jets. Again, only 5 wins there last year. And I think the reason they're staying away from this matchup, even though they are playing the Jets, who didn't do very well last year, there were so many questions in the offensive locker room for this Pittsburgh Steelers. I don't think on the road against a team that has a lot of great names on defense like the Jets, that you'd really want to go up against that with the Steelers offense. On the Jets side of the defense, they got Quinnen and Quincy Williams and Sauce Gardner, their cornerback. They got really Pro Bowl caliber players at all three levels of that defense, being Quinnen Williams on the D-line, Quincy at linebacker, and Sauce at the cornerback level. They got some names on offense like Breece Hall, who's now coming in the season healthy, Garrett Wilson at wide receiver, Justin Fields, who looked solid there in Pittsburgh last year. 2.5 points is definitely something you want to consider. I think just looking on paper, you weigh the Steelers versus the Jets, and you weigh the Steelers much heavier, but I think this is a matchup to avoid them in week 1 of the season on the road. Looking at one final team here that I would heed a little bit caution on, might be a little surprising to a lot of people, and this is my weakest perceived caution, but I'm a little bit nervous of this Commanders game hosting their divisional opponents, the Giants. I think the main thing that steps out of me is you're looking at a Commanders team that made it all the way to the NFC Championship last year, and you're looking at a Giants team that was pretty anemic in most aspects of the football last year, getting the 3rd overall pick. And yet the Commanders are only 6 points favorites. That means if this game was played at a neutral site, that the Commanders would be right around 3-point favorites. And if this game was even played in the Meadowlands with the Giants hosting, this would be closer to a pick'em game, which really starts to scratch my head. Is again, you think of the Commanders being a much more solid team than the Giants. I don't think there's much in terms of looking at the depth chart and roster here that would point for a Giants sweeping win here or an upset, but it's certainly possible when you're playing a divisional opponent. And I think what the great equalizer here is, and what will be the formula of success if the Giants are to pull off the upset here, is the difference in the trenches, especially with the Giants defensive line being the 6th best pass rush grade last year, and then getting Abdul Carter with the 3rd pick out of Penn State should be an immediate impact of getting to the quarterback, taking advantage of the poor pass blocking and really poor offensive line unit that the Commanders had last year, being a bottom 10 unit in both pass and run blocking. If the Giants are going to want to have a chance, it's going to need to be exploiting that weaker offensive line for the Commanders and leaning on the strengths of their pass rush. And then another big fear of mine is that the Commanders had the 3rd worst defense in the league last year, not being able to stop the run nor the pass effectively, ranking in the bottom 5 in each of those respective rankings last year. I think what a lot of people overlook is that the success of Jaden Daniels in this offense kind of overshadowed a lot of criticism that might have been warranted on this Commanders team, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But when you're winning games, people turn a blind eye. It's going to be a different story here, or could be a different story here, as you see guys like even CJ Stroud, after his tremendous rookie season, fall into a little bit of a sophomore slump. I think there are sky-high expectations for Jaden Daniels, and we'll see if he can live up to them. But it's not something that I think is a wise choice here. With a little bit of a fishier line here at only -6, you can't really evaluate this Giants offense clearly because you're exiling Daniel Jones. You're bringing in a pretty solid quarterback from Russell Wilson that led the Steelers to the playoffs last year. You've got Malik Neighbors, who's a budding superstar wide receiver for the Giants too, going up against, again, a bottom 5 coverage unit here for the Commanders. I think this is just an odd line, an odd game. You probably will get away with it if you pick the Commanders here, but this game I do believe is going to be tighter than a lot of people believe. Looking at the best pick, and as it often is, it's the team at the top of the list here. It's the Denver Broncos at home hosting the team that had the worst record in the league last year in the Tennessee Titans. This is one of the few games that are favored by more than 7 points here, and certainly the only game of that caliber that is at home against a non-divisional opponent. So all the stars are aligning there. What I really love about this game here, and why I'm so bullish on the Broncos, at least in week 1, but for the whole season, to be completely clear, is how great of a strength they have in what I think are often the 2 most overlooked pieces of football, and that's their offensive line and their defense as a whole. Really, I'll start with the offensive line that I mentioned. They had the best pass blocking grade in the NFL last year. That's why I think you saw so much success, to most people's surprise, from rookie quarterback Bo Nix. It's because he had so much room to operate back there in his rookie season. They brought back all 5 of those guys on offense and the offensive line, so you should see similar success, or at least stability, from that side of the football. And on the defense, just such a smothering defense last year. Having Patrick Surtain Defensive Player of the Year at cornerback really helps. But it's the off-season moves, as I had started to dig deeper into what they were up to in the summertime, that really start to make me believe that this is going to be the most terrifying defensive unit in football. Again, I mentioned how great they were last year and being a top 5 unit all around. They added Dre Greenlaw, linebacker for the 49ers, Talanoa Hufanga, safety from the 49ers, both of them who had some health issues, but coming back here at full strength, really adding to this defensive unit in Denver. They used their first-round pick on Jahdae Barron, a cornerback to go alongside former first-round pick Pat Surtain here, so really making that secondary even more stifling. And then at the end of the day, you're playing a team, the Titans, that, again, had the worst record in the year last year, used the number 1 pick on Cam Ward, but there's not a lot of talent around him. I do believe he'll be a solid quarterback, but it's going to be hard on week 1 with the lack of talent that he has, especially at the wide receiver position around him, going up against the defense of the caliber that the Broncos possess. Even on defense for the Titans, there's nothing too much to write home about. As they're really the only shining star on this team is Jeff Simmons at D tackle, but he can't solve all of their problems. They had a really poor pass rush here. Again, playing into the number 1 pass blocking game for the Broncos, you should see Bo Nix and this wide receiving unit that is admittedly a little thin have plenty of time to operate in the backfield. This is a subpar defense for Tennessee, with the other weaker link being coverage. Again, I think that plays into the Broncos' favor here, as their weaker spot is at least in the wide receiver position. Ultimately, I don't think the Broncos need to put up many points to, 1, win this game and clear the spread, as I think the Titans, in their lackluster offense, is going to really struggle to put up points, especially with how great the secondary unit is in Denver. I just am enamored by what the Broncos have on defense right now. Head coach Sean Payton, too, usually figures things out in offense, as he did last year with rookie Bo Nix. I assume this offense takes a step forward, and Denver builds on the 10-win season they put together last year. I love the Broncos this week, and will be picking them for my survivor pick. The other pick, not just the other pick, but one other pick you might want to consider, and one that I think is a tremendous value, is the Cardinals here on the road against the Saints. I think you're going to see this as a common theme this season in these videos, where the best value team is often going to be the team playing the Saints, as I think personally they're going to be the worst team in football, and I think that's what a lot of sportsbooks have as the odds-on favorite to have the fewest wins this season. There's a ton of holes on this Saints team everywhere, but especially on their offensive line in the pass blocking, which helps a team like the Cardinals that doesn't necessarily have the best pass rush unit in football, but certainly making coordinated efforts this offseason to get there. Again, not the best pass rush for the Cardinals, actually the third worst last year in terms of pass rush. They did some work again in the offseason. They got Josh Sweat from the Eagles. That'll be a huge help. They got Calais Campbell. He's a little bit older, but will really help bolster down this defensive line and patch up that weak spot on their defensive unit. And then I mentioned holes on the Saints team. Where they really exist is on their defense side of the football, ranking the third worst last year overall in defense. Second worst in the run defense. Bottom 10 coverage, poor pass rush, really nothing going for them on defense. And this goes up against the sixth best offense last year in the Cardinals, who I think actually take a step up this year as they have Marvin Harrison Jr. I think they drafted fourth, maybe fifth in the draft last year. Really didn't live up to the expectations, but the talent there is undeniable. I think with him, Trey McBride, James Conner, even Trey Benson as the backup running back, you start to see this offense get even more scary than it was last year. They got a great pass blocking O-line, which is something that's Kyler Murray has been lacking for most of his tenure in this team. That's really held down by former first-round pick Paris Johnson Jr., a left tackle out of Ohio State. Like I said, fourth best pass blocking unit in football. You get guys like Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride going against a really poor coverage unit in the Saints. Even running the ball between the tackles against, again, the second worst run defense here. It's going to be really tough for Spencer Rattler coming into this offense with really the only options that he has to get the ball to is Kamara, who's, I think, 30 years old. Been doing great, but definitely his production's been slowing down in these last few seasons of his career. And then Chris Olave, who's a tremendous, again, another first-round pick out of Ohio State at wide receiver, but he's had his injuries, especially with concussions. And outside of him, you don't have a ton of depth at that receiving core either. I think you see the Cardinals put up points early and often here against the Saints and have a really good matchup here in Week 1, even on the road. And take a look at these schedules here, especially, again, one that I just called out for the Cardinals. It's not like they have the easiest schedule in the world. They do have a couple of nice matchups coming up here at home against Carolina, where I think it's going to be a little bit better than they were last year. You start to see them come alive in the second half of the season, and then you do get them Week 5 at home against the Titans, which is a pretty great matchup for this Cardinals team. But again, I do think, and most sportsbooks think, that the Saints will have the fewest wins in the NFL this season, and I think it's a great time to go against them against Week 1 when Spencer Rattler really has few experience with this team and this roster in its current state here. You can even look at some other teams if you're looking for value of yourself. Like the Patriots, 2.5-point favorites here, don't have a tremendous schedule. I think they take a step up this year, but it's certainly a gamble. We'll get to that later. Same with the Steelers, not a ton on their schedule that you like either, at least throughout the first 10 weeks. So something to consider as well if you're looking for even deeper value than what I presented with the Cardinals here. Looking at the other games as promised, start with the Eagles kicking off the season at home against the Cowboys on Thursday Night Football. This game used to be in favor of the Eagles by 6.5 points. Once the line makers found out that Jalen Hurts and this Eagles offense would no longer be going up against Micah Parsons and this Cowboys defense, this line moved to -7.5. Even more reason to love the Eagles here. I think hard for me to take a look at this game and think the Eagles lose. Not a lot of change on offense from last year, bringing back just about everyone on that dominant O-line. Saquon Barkley coming off a 2,000-yard rushing season. Great wide receivers in A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith. And then Jalen Hurts, who's not the most tremendous and prolific pass router, but a very solid quarterback, really evening the odds with his run ability and rushing ability with this offense and creating just another wrinkle to this offensive scheme. Big question here is how the Eagles are going to look without offensive coordinator Kellen Moore, who is now taking a head coaching job for the aforementioned Saints. But again, a lot of the talent, almost all the talent, still there on the offensive side of the football. Lost a few key guys on the defensive side of the football. Added in backfield a little bit, one through the draft and two through free agency, but I still think this defense is going to be a very dominant unit under Vic Fangio, defensive coordinator for the Cowboys. Very poor defense, especially after losing Micah Parsons. One shining spot for them is Deron Bland, but even still, after getting a $90 million contract, he still leads a below-average coverage unit. This run defense was third worst in the league last year, and now they lost Micah Parsons, and it certainly can't help it. It's a bottom 5 defensive unit that looks to be taking a step back this year without Micah Parsons. I don't think that bodes well for them, as the Eagles should be able to put up points in a hurry and in quick succession against this Cowboys defense. You got a few bright spots on offense. Dak Prescott coming back from some injury, and then CeeDee Lamb, one of the best wide receivers in football. But even then, that cannot be nearly enough to cover up the holes against the defending Super Bowl champion that is keeping a lot of key players on both sides of the football. I really do like the Eagles here. The only reason I'm not taking them, frankly, is because I just love the Broncos so much more this week. Looking at another divisional game, this time on the road, you got the Bengals taking on the Browns. I think we all have a bad taste in our mouths, at least most of us do. Remembering last season, the Bengals dropping the season opener against the Patriots, a team that they were actually favored more than anyone in Week 1 in the 2024 season to win, and they still dropped it. This team historically comes out to slower starts, inexplicably. I do think the Bengals win this game here, but I think just by virtue of what happened last year, Week 1, with relatively the same team on offense and defense, frankly, not making a lot of moves this offseason were the Bengals, and being on the road against a divisional opponent, albeit the Browns, makes me pretty weary of picking this game. What's always going to be the call out when you're thinking about taking the Bengals in Survivor is, one, their defense, which was a bottom 10 unit last year and continues to be, and two, the unpredictability of the offensive line being a bottom 3 unit in both pass blocking and run blocking, which really makes it worrisome for a guy that has had such injury history like Joe Burrow, who is constantly running for his life behind a poor offensive line that the general management in Cincinnati refuses to sculpt up in the offseason and repair. I like the Bengals to win here, but again, that really poor offensive line against one of the best pass rushing units in football in Cleveland could be an equalizer in this game. You know, it's hard for me to picture a world where the Browns win this one, but if they're going to do so, it's going to be by taking advantage of the subpar defense that the Bengals have and really leaning on the Browns' pass rush unit to smother Joe Burrow and not allow him to let his star receivers in Jamar Chase and T. Higgins have time to get open downfield. The Browns, not just with their pass rush, get it done in the run defense as well, forcing the Bengals maybe to become a little bit more one-dimensional than they like, again, behind the poor offensive line unit and going up against one of the best run defenses in football with the Browns. You expect to see the Bengals be passing early and often here, and that has a recipe for disaster if this Browns pass rush can get going. A little bit of caution here with the Bengals. Not as much as the ones I called out, because I do think they're going to win this game, but I think I just laid out the very realistic possibility of how the Browns can take advantage and sneak one past the Bengals at home here against their divisional rival. This is a game that I'm really intrigued about here with the Jags versus the Panthers. As I mentioned earlier in the video, you did see the Panthers start to come alive at the second half of last season with Bryce Young started to have a little more comfortability within this offense. He's certainly going to be even more comfortable this year as they use their first-round pick to take the first wide receiver off the board in Tedoroya McMillan. He's 6'5", big target that I'm sure Bryce Young will become well acquainted with early and often. It's actually interesting because the Panthers had more wins last year than the Jaguars, and yet the Jaguars are the favorite here. I think the big reason why is that they are going to build off a tremendous rookie season from Brian Thomas Jr., wide receiver out of LSU, and using their second pick in the draft, having a great young wide receiver tandem, getting Travis Hunter, the former Heisman Trophy winner out of Colorado that plays both ways at wide receiver and cornerback on defense. This Jaguars team is getting Liam Cohen, the former offensive coordinator from the Buccaneers. He's been known as a quarterback whisperer and offensive guru, having a lot of success for the Rams, especially with that slot receiver role in Cooper Kupp, and going over to the Buccaneers. reviving Baker Mayfield's career, having such great success with Chris Godwin in the slot, and that slot position is the same spot that Travis Hunter, potentially the most talented wide receiver off the board here, and that slot position in his offense. I mentioned that McMillan was the first wide receiver taken off the board. I say that because he's the only true wide receiver taken out of that spot. Hunter, again, playing wide receiver and cornerback here. I think this is going to be an interesting game because of the strides that the Panthers made in the second half of last season. But what I cannot overlook is that the Panthers flat out had the worst defense in football last year, despite the strides their offense started to make towards the back half of the season. They were dead last in run defense, third worst in coverage, non-existent pass rush. With the talent I just described the Jaguars have, certainly at wide receiver, and then even at running back with their committee between Travis Etienne and Tanks Bigsby, I think the Jags are in a good spot here to get first-time head coach Liam Cohen his first win at home against a team that only was going to muster up 5 wins last year behind a really poor defense and one they didn't do too much to repair during the offseason. And then finally, the last game I want to talk about is one I actually really like. And it's interesting because we're looking at pretty identical teams here in the fact that both these guys had 4 wins last year, bringing in new veteran head coaches, with the Raiders bringing in Pete Carroll, Patriots bringing in their former player and Titans head coach Mike Vrabel. I really like the Patriots in this matchup, honestly, and it's hard for me to say that knowing that they're only maybe a field goal favorites, but I think they did so much this offseason to far and away improve their roster, where I think this is going to be maybe a coming out party in week 1 for the Patriots to show how big of improvements they made since last season. Just to rattle through a few of the lists, they brought in Milton Williams, D-tackle from the Eagles. He's the highest paid player on their roster and going to be a huge factor in both the run defense and pass rush at that defensive tackle position. They brought in Harold Landry at linebacker, formerly a Titan under Mike Vrabel, that should fit in this defense very quickly. Carlton Davis at cornerback from the Buccaneers and the Lions to help out Christian Gonzalez at cornerback. Offensive line was a huge issue for the Patriots last year, far and away the worst unit in the league. They used their 4th overall pick on Will Campbell, right tackle at LSU. They got Garrett Bradbury at center from Minnesota, tackle Morgan Moses from the Jets. Again, spending all this money in the offseason to patch up these weak spots all around their both offensive and defensive unit. Use your 2nd-round pick on running back from Ohio State, Travion Henderson, who should flourish behind this newly revamped offensive line. And they brought in veteran wide receiver Stephon Diggs to help out this receiving core. You'd be hard-pressed to find a team that made more impactful in as many moves as the Patriots did this offseason. I think they addressed just about all their weaknesses. What they really needed to put it all together was Drake May to take a step up and become a true quarterback leader on this team. I think if he can do that, the Patriots could even blow out the Raiders this game, who, outside of the Panthers, they had the worst defense last year with far and away the worst coverage unit as well. So while the Patriots didn't have a great receiving core, now they have Stephon Diggs. They have a very favorable matchup against the 2nd worst defense and, again, the worst coverage unit in football for the Raiders. The Raiders lost Devontae Adams. Now they do have Brock Bowers at tight end, but it still leaves the wide receiver room pretty thin. They just traded for Amari Cooper, which should help out, but on such short notice, it's going to be hard for him to get well acquainted with this offensive system right away. Looking more so for Jacoby Myers to carry the load early on. They do have Ashton Jonty, who they drafted in the top 10 pick in this year's NFL draft out of Boise State, runner-up in the Heisman contest. But it doesn't matter who you put behind this Raiders offensive line, as they had a really poor unit last year, struggling both the run and pass block here. And if that trend continues, it's going to be tough selling for this offense, and Geno Smith is the new quarterback in this system. A lot of changes on offense for this Raiders team in the offseason. Again, new quarterback, new wide receiver 1 and 2, new running back, and new head coach. Really the only constant being Brock Bowers there. It's a lot of change in the offseason and not in the favorable kind like the Patriots made. I think, again, the Patriots have a really good matchup here against a 4-win opponent in the Raiders that didn't do nearly as much as the Patriots did to improve in this offseason. So just to get a quick recap here, just going line by line, talking about each team that we referenced here. I love the Broncos this week, really behind the backs of what I think is going to be one of the better defenses we've seen in recent memory, and building upon that offensive line that has given Bo Nix so much time in allowing him the opportunity to take a step up in his second year. What I think is going to be the big key for the Broncos is getting their wide receivers behind Courtland Sutton in on the action early and making sure that this wide receiver room isn't as shallow as maybe I perceive it to be. For the Eagles here, very similar to the Broncos in a stifling defense, going up against a weaker team, again the Cowboys. After trading away Micah Parsons, this defense is reeling, really struggling against the run game, which is where the Eagles thrive, behind an offensive line where they're bringing just about everybody back, including 2,000-yard rusher Saquon Barkley. Hard for me to see the Eagles losing this game. For the Cardinals here, I think they got a tremendous amount of value going up against the Saints, who have a poor defensive unit, especially going up against the Cardinal strength on offense, taking a step up this year, I think, with Trey McBride getting in the end zone a little bit more, and then Marvin Harrison Jr. showing why the Cardinals spent so much draft capital to get him. And then on the offense side of the football for the Saints, you got a lot of change with new head coach Kellen Moore, who has had a lot of success in his career calling plays, but I think he finds himself in a situation where he's got one of the thinnest talent rosters in the NFL, and on offense, you're going up with maybe on paper the worst starting quarterback here in Spencer Rattler, certainly the most unproven of a non-rookie quarterback. I think the Saints are going to have their challenges early and often. Commanders, I'm a little bit scared of this game. So I think a lot of people would imagine the spread to be more than 6 points. I think that's virtuous enough to start to give you caution. But again, against a divisional opponent, against a Giants team that brought in Russell Wilson, who's won just about every step of the way in his career and had success and certainly competed. Giants have a superstar, probably the best player outside of quarterback in this game in Malik Neighbors. And then they got an equalizer in the pass rushing unit against a weak Commanders offensive line. And all on the backdrop here, the Commanders have a pretty poor defense unit themselves, so I'm a little bit nervous of that game. I think, again, that's going to be a closer outcome than people imagine. Might be able to say the same thing for the Bengals. Very similar story where they got a ton of offensive talent. They struggle on defense. They're playing a Browns team with minimal talent on offense, but again, their great equalizer being the pass rush as well, going up against a very poor offensive line and pass blocking unit for the Bengals. We've seen the Bengals stumble out of the starting block before in week 1. I think that is reason enough to maybe be a little bit cautious of them this week as well. For the Chiefs, yet another game in the string of divisional opponents here. The Chiefs not playing a home game, playing this one in Brazil against the Chargers that have competed with them and held them to one-score games at the very least all of last season and even beyond that. The Chargers, with their great defensive unit, even losing Joey Bosa at the end, have a very solid defense that has held the Chiefs to under 20 points in the last 2 matchups. I wouldn't be surprised if they were able to do that again. And the last thing you want to do is be taking a low-scoring dogfight game in Week 1 of Survivor. I think it's reason enough to stay away from the Chiefs. Jaguars here really just outflanked the Panthers on offensive firepower with, again, Travis Hunter and Brian Thomas Jr. at wide receiver against the worst defense in the league last year in the Panthers. I think both these teams actually take a step up this year, and it's a little bit scary of a game to be taking at -3 in Week 1, but certainly value here as the Jaguars host the Panthers in Week 1. I agree with a lot of value in the same front with the Patriots, with a ton of offseason spending in great draft picks. Quite frankly, I love their first and second round picks. With the Raiders, who basically traded Devontae Adams for Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper needs to get reacquainted with his offense, and then again, one of the most atrocious units, certainly in the secondary in football, that I saw last year. Not a lot of things in the offseason and actions in the offseason to improve upon that. I think the Patriots have a really great matchup here in Week 1, and I think outside of the Cardinals, they actually represent the most value that you see this week. Well, that's all I got for you guys this week. Be sure to join the Professional Picks Survivor League held on Splash Sports. I'll put the link in the description. Again, you'll get $10 from signing up, and you can essentially play this Survivor League against me and everyone else for free with a chance to win thousands of dollars. So, hoping for everyone to have the best of luck in Week 1 and hoping to see you again in Week 2.